Welcome back, fellow shop rats. Today we're going to talk a little bit about, well, my background and what has given me a very particular set of skills. Skills that make me a nightmare for the projects we have here at MKS. In all seriousness, there is a reason why I'm good with mechanical stuff and body work, and well, we're going to get into it, so don't go away. I'm Mike.
This is My Cars Shop.
To put together a show like MKS and do 3 episodes a week with the amount of video that we do and the 12 different projects that we are working on here, plus other projects that we interject here and there, does require a fairly good, broad skill set, being mechanical work and body work and upholstery and all kinds of the thing, just all the stuff it requires to completely restore a car yourself. I'm certainly not saying I'm the best in the world at all of this stuff, but I've been doing this for a long time, and over the years of my life, I've worked both professionally and so forth. And so I want to talk a little bit about that today. For some of you, this is going to be a review, but I realized that I haven't talked about this particular subject in several years, and that was probably a couple thousand subscribers ago. It was channel viewer Chumley who made a comment about a month ago on one of the videos. I think it was the video where I was actually taking the dent out of the quarter panel on the Stitches Challenger, and he mentioned, he asked a specific bodywork question, but then he mentioned that it's unique to find somebody who has both mechanical skills as well as body skills. So I want to kind of bring you back a little bit to how I got this way.
Besides my mom dropping me on my head when I was 2.
From the earliest age that I can remember, I've always had an interest in all things mechanical and all things automotive, lawnmowers, motorcycles, bicycles. Even as a kid, I had 4 or 5 bicycles sometimes, 10-speed, BMX bike, chopper, all these different bicycles. I would scrounge and come up with old lawnmower motors to work on, try to get them running, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. That's as far back in my memory bank as I can remember. I've always been that way, taking things apart, curiosity, but particularly all things gasoline powered has been a fascination for me. So it was natural for me as I got into high school. Well, first of all, my good friend Ron was subscribing me every year to CarCraft magazine, which is probably where my interest in girls and cars both came from. But he was subscribing me to that, and that was in the big 80s Pro Street era. And if you look at the cars that I have, you see I have Pro Street and 80s Street Rod style, and I'm an 80s guy from the 70s, et cetera, et cetera. But that's where it all came from. So when I got into high school, we moved my junior year, and the opportunity was to be able to go to the tech center to take auto mechanics. Unfortunately, we moved too late in the year and I couldn't get into enrollment, so I went and took a farm shop class. Now, I didn't grow up a farm kid. I grew up I won't say a city kid, but a town kid. So that was moving to an agricultural area where we live now, and taking farm shop was a big change for me in my thinking. It was in farm shop with Mr. Clark that I discovered something that I didn't know anything about, and that was metal fabrication. I discovered welding, stick welder, how to melt 2 pieces together and take nothing and make something, sort of. I wasn't very good at it. But also that year, which was 1982, the school purchased the first wire welder they'd ever had in the shop. So I was one of the first students to learn how to do MIG welding, which was just, I knew how to stick weld pretty well at that point, but it was a huge jump forward for me to jump into the world of doing MIG welding and be able to melt 2 pieces of metal together and make a very beautiful weld at 17 years old. But even before I had a driver's license, I was already buying cars. I had purchased a 70 Dodge pickup, 383 4-speed. I picked up a 68 Roadrunner clone car. I had a 72 Pinto, 72 Demon, 73 Duster, 68 Dart GT, 70 Dart Swinger, 72 Dart Swinger, and I own most of those cars within a couple of years, and they overlapped. I didn't have all of those at once, but I had I had a 68 GTO in there also. But definitely packed them all together, and I always had anywhere from 3 to 5 cars from 82 through 84. Even after I left home, when I moved to Indianapolis to go to Lincoln Tech for auto diesel technician, I had, I think, 4 or 5 cars down there at one time. So it's always been a thing for me to have a lot of cars. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let's back up to my senior year in high school. I took the farm shop my junior year and learned how to weld. And then my senior year, I got into the tech center, into the automotive program, and went through a self-study accelerated course in basics of front end alignments, brakes. I didn't do a lot of engine work at that point, but just basic mechanical stuff, and really excelled at it. Actually competed in the VICA, Vocational Industrial Club of America, automotive competition. Didn't do real well, but considering that that was my first experience with hands-on stuff, I was hooked, and I made the decision that then I was going to go to tech school. So sorry, I got ahead of myself there. So I enrolled in Lincoln Tech. After I left there, I didn't complete school. I came back and went to college, and just kind of free ranged for a while at a junior college, but then went on to university because Becky and I had been together since '82 at that point. She went to Northern Michigan University, so I followed, and I was taking a course in my degree course was for a bachelor's degree in history, but I had all these tech school credits that I didn't want to go to waste. I thought if I can get those to apply to my degree, that would save me thousands and thousands of dollars, and quite frankly, a lot of time. I talked with my academic advisor about it and said, can I get a liberal studies major with a technical minor? And good old Dr. Stenkamp, no. Well, I'm not one to take no for an answer. So I started looking at what other schools offered, and lo and behold, several colleges. Ferris State University, they might have been a college at that time. They might have been, I don't remember. Anyway, Ferris State definitely offered liberal study majors with technical minors, and Central Michigan University also did. So I went to the department head, the history department head, my academic advisor's boss, Dr. Behrens was her name. And I went to her and I said, these other schools, and I laid it out, offer these programs. I'm a mechanic, certified mechanic at that point, and I would love to get into a technical minor with a liberal studies major. Basically, what my thinking was is I wanted to go work as a mechanic, but I wanted to have a bachelor's degree in my back pocket in case I got injured and could no longer continue doing work. At the same time that all of that was happening, I happened to be out and about one day and saw a gorgeous 63.5 turquoise Galaxy Ford 390 4-speed car go putting by. And it was anything old car I love. So I followed it to, lo and behold, what was a hot rod shop in town that I didn't know existed. Got to know the owner. Wasn't too long before I was going and hanging out there and talking to him off and on. And he said to me one day, are you looking for some work? I was already working at the university as a custodian, but if you think I'm going to pass up the opportunity to work in a hot rod shop, you're crazy. I said, oh, I'd love to. Yes, what are you looking for? He said, I need somebody to sweep and clean. I said, I am down with that. So that involved me putting in a serious amount of time sweeping and cleaning and just polishing that place up. He had about 10 muscle cars or fat fender cars, which is where my love of fat fenders came from. And pretty soon we're getting to know each other, and he's having me do some light mechanical work, and then I'm starting to do a little bit of body work here and there. Before long, I'm also running the parts counter, selling performance parts, and it just grew. I was there for about 2 years, I think. And by the time I left there, I was managing the place, basically. And there was just the three of us. I call him the best body guy in the world, my buddy Jack. And and Dave, that was the owner. We had another kid that would come in once in a while, but he didn't stick around real long. He didn't get the opportunity that was being offered. The problem I had at that point was I was married, and we were starting a family, and I needed better income than what he was able to provide. So unfortunately, I had to leave there, and I went to work at Choice Motors in Marquette, Michigan as a mechanic, because they offered benefits and so forth, and you know how that goes. So my career starts moving forward, and I'm working there, and we decide that about the time our son was born that we wanted to move from northern Michigan back down to where we live now to be closer to her family. And so we made that move, and I took a job at that time, which was People Magazine's top 10 dealerships in the country, Ford Chrysler in Cass City, Michigan. So they hired me, and we went back up north. I came down for the interview. They hired me. I went back up north. We packed everything up and moved down here within a week, and I went to work there. Worked there for 2 years, 3 years, something like that. And started out just as a wrench. Went to school down for Master Tech stuff. I think it was Master Tech. I got all the awards and Gold Tool Awards and all that stuff from being a mechanic in those years. This was in the late 80s, early 90s. And I wrenched for a year or two and then ended up becoming service manager in the dealership there. This is where it gets really interesting. There was this guy that would come into the dealership to talk all the time, and he had a Dakota pickup, and it had the typical noisy fluid fan and all kinds of typical stuff on those 90s Dakotas. So he was in all the time, and he was very knowledgeable, asking questions, talking about stuff. I didn't know who the guy was. I mean, I'd seen his name on a paper, but I did not connect the dots at this point as to who this guy was. And the other mechanic, the head mechanic, Dave, and I were talking one day after he left, and he said, "You do know who that is, don't you?" "It's Tom." "I don't know. Who is it?" He said, "That's Tom Hoover." And I know who Tom Hoover is, right? I still didn't make the connection. And he said, "Father of the Hemi, Tom Hoover?" What? There was Tom. So I got to know Tom over the time that I worked at the dealership there, and I took over as service manager and that kind of stuff. But my situation at the dealership was kind of taking a turn for the south. Dealership was going through some rough times, and I had a different management style than what they were looking for. I'm willing to do the job that I'm being paid to do, but I'm not going to compromise my own integrity in things. And they weren't asking me to do anything unethical or illegal, don't misunderstand me, but they had a specific way they wanted things done that didn't fit my particular style of management. And so I started looking for a job. I had happened to be delivering a car, one of the corporate vehicles, to Walbro Corporation, which was in our hometown there in Cass City. And I saw a sign that said they were accepting applications for application technicians. I don't know what that is, but I said, "Give me an application." So I got an application from the gal at the counter and took it back with me home and was filling it out and so forth. And Tom was the engineering manager for a program there at Walbro. And by this time, he and I had become loosely, socially friends. We knew each other, that kind of stuff. And I happened to go into a restaurant next to the dealership one day to grab some lunch, and he was in there having lunch. So I walked up to him and I said, "Can I interrupt you for a minute?" He said, "Sure. What do you need, Mike?" I said, "I was just, the other day I was down dropping off a vehicle, and I noticed that you're hiring application technicians. What is that?" He said, "Give me your resume." So I gave him my resume, and a couple days later I got a call for an interview. And there was two things that were known for. If Tom wanted you in, you got in. And if he really liked you, you would basically spend the whole day in an interview. There was the Tom interview and meeting all the other engineers and technicians, and then there was what we call the Ozzy Bosch interview. Ozzy was an engineer from Brazil. He was German. Brilliant guy. He ended up eventually becoming my boss later on down the road. And he went to work at Holley after he left the company, and we still kept in contact for a while. But anyway, unbeknownst to me, Tom basically liked me. He knew my skills as a mechanic, and they needed technicians that had good mechanical ability. So Tom hired me for the job. While I was doing my job every day, Tom would make his rounds and always end up in my lab. I was working on fuel injection development for direct injection for two-stroke engines for Orbital Engine Company out of Perth, Australia. That was actually the project. It was called the Orbital Walbro Program, Orbital Walbro Corporation, OWC. And inevitably, he would end up in my lab, and we would end up shooting the breeze, and he would share all kinds of ram charger history, and we would talk techie stuff. And if I was building an engine, we would talk engine building stuff. And just, I wish I would have had a cell phone or some kind of a voice recorder to record all of those conversations that went on for the few years until Tom retired. We became personal friends, much more so. I would go out to his house, help him work on his cars. He had 60. There was an old Sox and Martin race car. It's a famous car. You guys are going to know probably more than I am. 68, 69 Barracuda. It had a Shadow Power 360, which was a development engine that they were working on, I believe, out of the Little Red Express program. He picked it up out of R&D before he left Chrysler. Rode in that car with him a couple times. Stupid fast car, fun. He was crazy behind the wheel. He also had a Batmobile, we called it. I think it was a DeSoto, and he put an old wide block engine, I don't remember, 325 maybe, 320 something or another, wide block Mopar engine in it, and I went out and helped him work on that and put the motor in it and stuff like that. So we got to be friends. He was also into model railroading, which I also am, so we had that commonality. So we would end up seeing each other at model railroad conventions and stuff like that. So really, Tom and I got to know each other pretty well. One of the highlights for me in that era was Tom inviting me down to, I believe it was called Vin Devers Dodge, to a Ram Chargers reunion. And Tom did a slideshow, which he allowed me to bring my big old VHS video camera, as long as I wasn't going to sell it, as long as it was for myself, to video that presentation. Unfortunately, my batteries kept dying and I didn't get all of it, but I have it, and I've got it converted over onto DVD, and someday I'll get that posted here on the channel. Tom's been gone now for quite a while, so I don't think he would object. And if he wants to come back and haunt me, that's fine. So that took me into that part of the career. Tom retired and left. Things in the company changed a little bit, and they offered me an opportunity. At that point, I had moved out of R&D, developing actual physical parts for direct injection, and moved into engine dynamometer testing. I was doing a lot of emissions and performance testing on the 3-cylinder orbital engine, emissions calibrations and that kind of stuff. So I ran the dyno for about a year. They decided to move the dyno to another plant, so I ended up having to disassemble the dyno and move it down and reassemble it at that plant in southern Michigan, get it all back up and running for them. But I really loved the dyno work at that point, and I started looking around. I applied at GM for a dyno position, but it was literally just it wasn't the science project that I was used to working on. So I ended up doing a lot of fixturing. I ended up doing a lot of fabrication for the company. I built test rigs, different test fixtures, developed some really unique testing equipment for the company. So that was fun. I get to go in and weld every day and fabricate stuff and engineer stuff and build drives and all kinds of stuff like that. I also ended up becoming their calibration technician. So I would go around, I think 3 or 4 times a year and calibrate all of the test equipment, all of the pressure transducers and differential pressure sensors and all that stuff. But I was not as happy as I was when I was doing the dyno stuff. So they came to me and they offered me an opportunity to go to work at Mercury Marine in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin. Our daughter, she was not even 2 at that point, I think. We went over there, we looked it over. The opportunity at Mercury was really exciting. And we decided to go ahead and make the move. So we packed everything up lock, stock, and barrel. I was actually in the middle of building my Pro Street GTS, which you've seen here on the channel. So we had to get that. I had spent like a week and a half to 2 weeks in the shop every experiment I had getting that car welded together enough to the point that I could put it on a trailer to haul it. So we got everything. The moving vans came, loaded everything up, took it. I got my truck loaded up, got my car loaded on the trailer. Becky stayed back to do some work on the house because we were renting the house out to a friend. And then she and the kids came over, I think 2 weeks later. After I moved, we'd found a place to live, etc. But I needed to get over there and get to work. So I worked at Mercury, did a lot of machine work, fabricating, mill work, lathe work, which I had been doing for years anyway, but hand fabricating stuff. But one day out of the blue, I was home and got a phone call from an engineering manager back in Cass City at Walbro and saying, hey, I just ran across your resume. I'd forgotten I even gave him one. We're looking for a senior development technician, a senior application specialist in our fuel pump group, and we're wondering if you might be interested. I said, well, talk to me. Well, you'll have to come for an interview. I said, well, that's a non-starter for me. I can't. I'm just not going to be able to come back right now for an interview, but I'm happy to do a telephone interview. So long story short, I set a salary cap in my mind where minimum where it needed to be, et cetera. And lo and behold, a few months later, after we were there in Fond du Lac, they made me an offer that fell within that salary range benefit package, and we packed it all up again and put the GTS on the trailer and moved back to this area in Michigan. So I became a program manager in charge of initially Chrysler in-tank fuel pumps for Walbro. And that would have been in the mid-90s. So a lot of the in-tank fuel pumps in that era were Walbro product. We manufactured them out in Meriden, Connecticut at our plant out there. So I ended up going back and forth to Connecticut some to look at that. And my job was to take the OE product, re-engineer it for the aftermarket. And also then we sold that product through Mopar Parts and get it out there to all the major distribution through Federal Mogul and blah, blah, blah. We had the distribution networks there. It was about at that point, I think a $5 million business. It wasn't huge, but it was growing. In the process of that, one of the other engineers decided to quit, moved on to something else, and he was in charge of all the Ford products. They offered to me, would you like to take on Ford as well? So I did. So I was in charge of Ford and Chrysler in-tank fuel pumps, product lines for the aftermarket, for Walbro, for a few years in there. And then I took on some other stuff like developing high performance pumps. It was basically adapting the Viper fuel pump that we built to use in other applications like Ford Mustangs, the pulse width modulated fuel systems in the mid-90s Mustangs. I did some unique stuff back in those days, one-off stuff just for R&D for customers that were putting fuel injection on muscle cars. So they would send me their sending unit out of the tank, and I would retrofit it with an in-tank fuel pump, that kind of stuff. A lot of fun little stuff like that. But the company got bought out and things started changing, and that became not as much fun anymore. And so I actually left the auto industry completely and went to Australia for some training, and I was a counselor for a lot of years. But because of the segment I was working in the nonprofit sector, I knew I needed supplemental income. So I went to work in body shops, and that's where I really started developing. I already had skills, but I really started getting better at my bodywork skills from working in mostly hot rod shops. Never really worked much in production environment as far as daily drivers, but I did a bunch of them for sure. But really started developing and getting better and better at the body skills. I'd already painted a half a dozen cars myself at that point for myself and other people. But that's when I really started focusing more into that part of it. I still maintain my certifications and so forth. But I worked in several different body shops and hot rod shops through that time while I was also still traveling all around the world, actually, because I was not only doing counseling, but I was also training counselors in the methodologies that I had developed as a counselor. One of the philosophies that I had was, if I am going to learn a specific set of skills, I want to be paid to do it. So I specifically chose career paths that took me into areas I knew very little about, started more at the ground floor and worked my way up, learned. That's how I learned bodywork. That's how I learned fabrication. That's how I learned, mechanics I went to school for. But that's how I've learned all of this stuff, was just simply, I wanted to get paid to learn it as much as possible. And I always figured the best way to learn was on other people's stuff, honestly. If the customer was satisfied with the work that I did, which they always were, then I knew I was developing good skills. Working under other highly skilled people who gave me opportunities. Tom changed my life. The things I owe him could never be repaid. And I owe him a debt of gratitude that's beyond measure for the chance he took on this young snot-nosed kid who was, service manager in a dealership. But that's kind of my background, how I got here and how I learned to do all of this stuff. Part of the issue always was we were very passionate about making sure that our kids stayed home. Or not our kids stayed home, I'm sorry, that Becky stayed home with the kids while they were growing up. We ended up homeschooling our kids as well. That is a full-time job. So we were surviving on my income in engineering or as a counselor. And I needed those supplemental incomes and so forth. So worked a lot of hours, but that's how we survived and got through. But then that meant there was no money to have toys. You will see that as a direct impact on the MKS channel. I don't throw money at stuff. I throw ingenuity at it. I throw engineering at it. I throw effort at it. I do things as inexpensively as possible because that's what I find the most fun. I have the 47 Ford as an example. That was a spare no expense car. I threw money at that car because I wanted to do a top-notch car for myself. But most everything else that I do is more like the Stitches Challenger. And I do that because that to me is the most fun. I do not enjoy swiping my credit card. I do not enjoy spending the money. I really enjoy taking a big 4x8 piece of metal and taking that and making something out of absolutely nothing. I do owe a debt of gratitude to several people along the way who gave me a shot. Being invited in to be an engineer or work as an engineering technician without a degree in engineering was not as unheard of back then as it would be now. These guys, these managers saw my potential. Some of them knew the kind of stuff that I did working on cars. They saw my specific set of skills and knew that would be beneficial, particularly in the fuel pump group. They knew that a mechanic would be the best person to write instructions on how to replace a fuel pump, much more so than a degreed engineer. And it really paid off in that because we really developed products that were practical and made a lot of sense. So yeah, that's kind of my career in a nutshell. Part of the reason I'm doing this is I don't know if my kids have ever actually seen or heard this story from beginning to end. I know they've heard pieces of it, and I thought, part of the reason for doing the channel is to showcase and capture for posterity what I do. But also things like this I think are important to pass down. I've always said, and you've heard me say this on the channel before, I do what I do because I'm just too stupid to know any better. That's true to a large degree, but most of the skills that I've developed have been because if I was going to have a nice car, if I was going to have a toy car, if I was going to have a muscle car, the only way that was going to happen was if I found the most creative and ingenious ways for that to happen, because we never had deep pockets to be able to do it. All right, drop your comments, your questions. If there's things you'd like me to talk about out of all of this. I threw a whole lifetime of history at you, obviously, 40 plus years of my career, only skimming the highlights, obviously. But that's what led us to this point here where in 2019, we started playing around with the YouTube channel. And when the pandemic hit in 2020, Becky said, you need to do this. People need to be able to share. You need to be able to share with people what you do so that others can benefit from it. So I also owe her a tremendous debt of gratitude for putting up with this car insanity all these 40 years we've been together. Well, 42 years. Actually, it is 42 years. So I really appreciate you being here. Thanks for listening to me ramble on and on like an old fart about back in the day when I was young, we used to walk to school uphill in the snow barefoot. Both ways. All right. We will catch you on the next one. Oh, don't forget. Raw.